Mark Hastings thought he was invisible, a shadow slipping through the edges of Lisa's new life. But the moment he stepped into the frame of a hidden camera, the illusion shattered, and his quiet obsession turned into undeniable evidence that would end his freedom forever. Mark Hastings had always seemed like an ordinary man, blending into the background in a world that rarely noticed him. He worked a steady job, kept his apartment neat, and had a quiet demeanor that gave people the impression of harmlessness. But beneath that calm exterior, a storm was building. When his relationship with Lisa ended, what could have been a moment of closure for both turned into the beginning of something far darker. Mark didn't just feel sadness or disappointment. He felt a consuming obsession, a need to maintain control over someone who had rejected him. At first, his actions seemed minor. He lingered on her social media posts longer than normal, memorizing details about her friends, her routines, the places she frequented. He left anonymous notes at her apartment, small, seemingly innocent reminders that he was still present in her life. Lisa, trusting that people had boundaries, dismissed these acts as quirks rather than warning signs. Mark's obsession grew in ways he didn't even notice himself. He became fascinated with patterns, with predictability. He tracked the times she left work, the cafes she visited on weekends, the routes she took on her runs. Every detail was cataloged, every deviation noted. He believed his knowledge gave him an advantage, a secret power over someone who had moved on. At the same time, Mark was unaware of how technology was beginning to map his life alongside hers. Cameras, smart locks, motion detectors, and even her social media posts created an invisible trail. Every step he took was being captured, logged, and archived without his realization. The very devices he thought could not see him were quietly recording, silently building evidence of his intrusion. In his apartment, Mark's obsession manifested physically. He had folders of notes, scribbled observations, printed photographs he claimed were for memory's sake, and journals filled with minute details about Lisa's movements. He didn't think of these as dangerous, only as a reflection of his dedication. Each entry, each map, each timeline was proof to himself of the precision of his observations. He felt a twisted satisfaction in knowing he could predict her next move. But every action taken in secrecy, every step he considered private, was laying the foundation for a future he could not foresee. Despite the growing darkness of his thoughts, Mark's behavior remained almost invisible to the world. Friends and colleagues noticed little because he masked his intensity behind a calm, controlled exterior. He continued to appear normal, attending work, going out with acquaintances, maintaining a life that seemed unremarkable on the surface. Yet within, every waking moment was consumed with Lisa. Every lunch break, every evening alone, every commute became an opportunity to observe, to analyze, to plan. He did not recognize that this level of scrutiny and control was not harmless curiosity. It was the first step toward disaster. What made Mark dangerous was his unwavering belief that he was invisible, that his actions were untraceable. He thought he could navigate this obsession without consequence, never suspecting that the very technology, the very connections he ignored, were quietly documenting his descent. Every online post, every unnoticed camera, every neighbor with a watchful eye was silently noting him, constructing a record he would one day be powerless to erase. By the time anyone realized the true extent of his obsession, Mark had already built a web of evidence around himself, tangled in a pattern he could not escape. Lisa believed she had escaped the shadow of her past when she moved to a new apartment on the quieter edge of the city. The building was surrounded by tall trees and narrow streets that offered peace and privacy. It felt like a place where she could breathe again. She changed her phone number, deleted old accounts, and started using a new name on social media. For the first time in months, she felt invisible in the best possible way. What she didn't know was that Mark had already begun reconstructing her life from fragments of digital footprints and silent observation. He had learned how to trace small clues, mutual friends who unknowingly shared her photos, delivery services that left addresses on receipts, and public records that exposed more than she realized. Mark visited the neighborhood in disguise, walking the streets at different hours, watching from corners, pretending to be a passerby. He had convinced himself that he wasn't stalking her, only making sure she was safe, twisting his own logic to justify his actions. The routine gave him a strange sense of calm. He believed he was controlling fate, as if ensuring her every move fit within his understanding. He watched her lights flick on in the evening, her curtains close, her shadow cross the window, and every movement became part of the rhythm of his obsession. But while Mark thought his presence went unnoticed, a neighbor across the street had begun to take note of strange patterns. An older man, retired after years as an investigator, had a habit of observing the small details others ignored. He noticed the same car parked on alternate nights, the same figure walking by at irregular hours, always facing the same building. He started recording dates, taking quiet photos from his own window, storing every observation without alerting anyone. At first, he thought it might be a coincidence, but the feeling grew stronger each time he saw that familiar face blend into the shadows. Mark's confidence increased with every visit. He believed his knowledge made him untouchable, that he could move through her life without leaving a trace. He took photos from a distance, noted her routines in a small notebook, and even followed her to nearby stores just to confirm her habits. Each time, he told himself this was the last time, that he only needed to know she was safe before he could move on. Yet each visit drew him deeper into his own delusion. He didn't yet realize that the retired investigator had already begun compiling a timeline that linked him to Lisa's new address. Lisa, unaware of either man's watchful eyes, continued living as though she had finally escaped. But subtle signs began to unsettle her. The faint sense of being followed, a missing package, a doormat slightly moved. She brushed them off, blaming her own anxiety for the unease. Mark, on the other hand, saw every unnoticed detail as proof of his superiority, believing he was clever enough to remain unseen. Yet the walls were closing in. The neighborhood's security cameras, the investigator's quiet vigilance, and his own careless habits were all converging into a silent trap. Every step he took to assert control was being recorded, analyzed, and connected. The illusion of invisibility that gave him comfort was already cracking, and the evidence of his obsession was gathering like storm clouds waiting to break. The night was cold and heavy with rain when Mark decided to act. He had convinced himself that he wasn't going to harm anyone, that all he wanted was to be seen, to remind Lisa that he still existed. But beneath that fragile excuse lay something far darker, a desperate urge to reclaim the power he thought he had lost. The streets were slick and empty as he parked a few blocks from her building, his mind rehearsing every step. He carried no weapon, but the intent in his actions made him dangerous. In his pocket was a small envelope containing a letter he had written, filled with words of blame, confusion, and obsession. To him, it was closure. To anyone else, it would look like a threat. As he walked through the dimly lit street, his reflection shimmered across puddles. He felt adrenaline pulse in his veins, a sense of being unstoppable. He did not realize that every movement was being captured by the building's new security system. The retired investigator, who had been monitoring the neighborhood for weeks, was awake that night. Through the window of his apartment, he spotted Mark approaching the entrance, moving with deliberate intent. Without hesitation, he began recording from his phone while alerting local authorities. Mark reached Lisa's door, rain dripping from his jacket. He placed the letter beneath the mat, pausing as if to savor the moment. He turned his head slightly, looking at the door as if expecting it to open. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the thrill of control. He whispered something under his breath, words meant only for himself, and turned to leave. But in that moment, a soft chime echoed from above. The motion sensor light blinked to life, illuminating his face in sharp detail. A camera hidden in the corner captured a clear, close image of him standing at her door. He froze, realizing too late what had happened. The sense of power drained from him instantly, replaced by panic. He rushed down the stairs, slipping slightly on the wet steps, glancing behind him as though someone might be following. He didn't see the patrol car turning onto the street, nor did he notice the flashing light from a window across the way. The retired investigator continued filming, zooming in as Mark stumbled into his car and drove off. Within hours, police reviewed the footage, confirming the same face that had been seen wandering near the property weeks earlier. By morning, Mark's confidence was shattered. The small act he thought was harmless had become undeniable proof of his intrusion. The digital trail extended far beyond that night. His phone's location data matched the times he had loitered near Lisa's home. Receipts placed him nearby on multiple dates. Even his social media logins revealed timestamps that overlapped with the footage. Everything he believed he was hiding was already in plain sight. He spent the day pacing his apartment, replaying the scene in his mind, imagining ways to undo what had been recorded. But there was nothing to erase. The line between secrecy and exposure had finally vanished, and for the first time, Mark began to sense that his world was unraveling. The arrest came quietly, without warning, on an ordinary morning that felt no different from any other. Mark had just stepped out of his apartment to collect his mail when two unmarked cars pulled into the lot. The officers moved with calm precision, their expressions unreadable, their voices steady as they called his name. There was no dramatic chase or shouting, just a sudden realization that the life he had carefully constructed was about to collapse. In that moment, Mark didn't resist. He stood frozen, the morning air cutting against his skin as handcuffs locked around his wrists. The quiet click of metal echoed louder than anything he had ever heard. Inside his apartment, investigators began their search. What they uncovered was worse than anyone expected. On his desk lay multiple notebooks filled with detailed entries about Lisa's life. Dates, times, locations, and even notes on what she wore or who she spoke to. On the wall were maps of her neighborhood marked with circles and arrows showing her daily routes. His computer contained folders labeled with her name, each one filled with photos and recordings he had taken without her knowledge. The discovery painted a picture of deliberate obsession, not fleeting emotion. Every item was cataloged, photographed, and sealed as evidence. The shock came when detectives found a small voice recorder hidden beneath his bed. When they played it, the sound of Mark's voice filled the room. He had been recording his private thoughts, confessions meant only for himself. In his monologues, he detailed his surveillance efforts, his anger, and his plans to confront her. He spoke as if explaining himself to an unseen audience, justifying every action as love misunderstood. Those recordings became the most powerful proof against him. The very tool he used to control his story became the one that destroyed it. As the evidence piled up, Mark sat alone in an interrogation room. The walls were bare, the air still, and the only sound came from the faint hum of a camera recording his silence. His mind raced through excuses, but each one dissolved into panic. He realized that every lie he might tell could be disproved in seconds. His phone S data placed him at her building on the exact nights the neighbor S footage showed him. The timestamps on his photographs matched the hours Lisa had reported feeling watched. The letter under her doormat had his fingerprints pressed into the paper. Every attempt to deny his actions would only tighten the chain around him. Meanwhile, Lisa was informed of his arrest. Relief mixed with disbelief as she learned the extent of what he had done. She had never imagined the depth of his fixation, the records, the hours of stalking that had defined his life in silence. For the first time, she felt both safe and unnerved by how close danger had been. Mark, on the other hand, sat motionless, staring at the wall, finally realizing that his version of control had turned into complete exposure. What he thought was love had revealed itself as evidence, and what he believed was invisible had become the map of his downfall. Mark sat in the courtroom days later, the fluorescent lights above him casting a harsh white glow that made everything feel unreal. The room was quiet except for the sound of papers shuffling and shoes sliding against the polished floor. Every corner seemed to echo his guilt back at him. The walls were lined with faces he didn't recognize, reporters, officers, strangers who had come to witness his unraveling. He stared straight ahead, barely breathing, as the prosecutor laid out the evidence piece by piece. The footage from the security camera, the maps, the journals, the recordings of his voice. Each piece connected seamlessly, leaving no space for denial. The story of his obsession had become a timeline of his own destruction. Lisa did not attend the trial, but her presence was felt in every word spoken. Her photographs, her testimony, her fear, all captured in statements that made the room grow heavier. The prosecutor described the slow, methodical stalking, the manipulation, the attempts to intimidate. Mark listened, expressionless, as his private world was exposed to everyone. Every secret detail he had guarded, every hidden thought he once whispered into that recorder was now evidence projected on a screen. The letter he thought would make her understand his pain now sat sealed in a plastic bag, labeled and tagged, no longer a message of emotion, but proof of intent. The defense tried to argue mental instability, suggesting loneliness and heartbreak had clouded his judgment, but the facts were too precise to dismiss. Mark's calculated notes, his careful tracking of Lisa's movements, the multiple visits to her new home, they painted a portrait not of a man lost in grief, but one consumed by control. Even the retired investigator who had gathered the first evidence testified with calm authority, describing how he had noticed the same car, the same man, the same pattern of presence that never fit with coincidence. His testimony sealed Mark's fate long before the verdict was announced. When the sentence was finally read, the words seemed distant, almost muted, as though they belonged to someone else. Years in prison, no contact, mandatory counseling. The judge's voice was steady, but the meaning struck like a hammer. Mark felt time collapse into a single moment of realization. The night at Lisa's door, the flash of the motion sensor light, the second he looked up and saw his reflection caught in the camera. That was the instant everything had turned against him. He hadn't understood it then, but it was the exact moment his life had begun to end. In the days that followed, his story became a warning whispered across news reports and online forums. People analyzed his behavior, speculated on his motives, dissected every step that led him to his downfall. But the truth was simpler than any explanation. It was never about love, never about heartbreak. It was about control and the illusion of invisibility. Mark had believed he could outsmart the world, that he could hide his obsession behind shadows and silence. Yet in the end, every secret had been recorded, every step traced, every plan exposed. The moment he thought he was untouchable had been the moment he was already caught.